I couldn't believe it when I saw the email. My heart sank into my stomach, and I had to read it twice to make sure I wasn't seeing things. The words on the screen were blurry, like they were shifting to mock me, but no matter how many times I blinked, they stayed the same. It was the school's official announcement for the annual academic competition, and in bold letters at the very top of the message was the list of participants. My name was there, Lucas Reed, the nerdy, introverted junior who spent more time in the library than he did socializing. But there was something else, something that made my pulse spike with sudden panic. My study partner, Brandon Davis. Brandon, of all people, the one person I never wanted to be paired with, the one person who made my high school life a living nightmare. My stomach churned as I stared at the name. Brandon Davis was the king of our school, a star athlete, a bully, and someone who seemed to delight in making my life difficult. Of course, I muttered under my breath, rubbing my temples in disbelief. Why wouldn't it be him? I could feel the weight of my chest tightening as I thought back to all the times he'd humiliated me. From the cruel comments in the hallways to the time he tripped me in front of everyone during a school assembly. He never passed up an opportunity to remind me that I was the weakling, the quiet kid who didn't belong in the same space as him. But now, somehow, we were supposed to work together? I quickly clicked off the email and shut my laptop with a slam, hoping the action would somehow erase the tension building in my chest. It didn't work. Instead, my mind raced and my thoughts spiraled. How was I supposed to work with Brandon? How could I focus on the academic competition when my entire body was filled with dread? I had no idea how I was going to survive this, but it wasn't like I had a choice. The next day, the anxiety was palpable as I walked into school. I kept my head down, trying to avoid eye contact with everyone, but it felt like the weight of the world was pressing against me. All I could think about was the study session I had with Brandon later that afternoon. The very idea made my palms sweat. I found him in the hallway between classes, leaning against a locker, smirking as he chatted with a group of his friends. I felt that familiar knot in my stomach tighten as I passed by. It was hard not to hear his voice, loud and obnoxious as always. He had that aura of confidence that made him seem untouchable, the kind of person who got away with anything. And then there was me, the quiet, socially awkward kid who just wanted to get through the day without drawing attention to myself. As I walked past him, I felt his eyes on me. I glanced up for a split second, only to meet his intense gaze. He raised an eyebrow, giving me that look, the one that said he was about to say something to make me uncomfortable. I braced myself, but instead of saying anything, he just chuckled under his breath, shaking his head. I knew it was meant to be a warning. He was still in control. That afternoon, I walked into the library for our study session, trying to calm my nerves. I wasn't sure what to expect, but I knew I wouldn't be getting much actual studying done. The room was quiet, the soft murmur of other students barely audible in the background. I found an empty table in the back, trying to keep my distance from Brandon. But of course, he followed me. He dropped his backpack on the chair across from mine and threw his feet up on the table as if he owned the place. "You really think we're going to actually study, Reed?" he asked, his voice dripping with that mockery that always made me feel small. "I don't know why they even bother pairing me with you. You're the last person I need to study with." I just stared at him, my mind racing, trying to find something to say, but my words felt stuck. "I didn't ask for this either, you know," I muttered barely above a whisper. Brandon only shrugged, unfazed by my discomfort. "Guess you're stuck with me now, huh?" He leaned back in his chair and stretched, the movement so casual that it made my stomach tighten even more. I hated how easy it was for him to make me feel so insignificant. I glanced at the study materials, some worksheets and a couple of textbooks, and sighed. I didn't have a choice but to try and get through this. So, I focused on the task at hand, opening a textbook and starting to read. But every now and then, I could feel Brandon's eyes on me. It wasn't subtle, and it made my skin crawl. "Relax, nerd. I'm not going to bite." He smirked again, his voice carrying just a little too much amusement. I couldn't help but let out a small, nervous laugh, which felt more like a nervous cough. "I'm not worried," I lied, pretending to focus on the page in front of me. The truth was, I was terrified. Not because of the material, but because being around him made me feel off balance. There were moments, small ones, where he didn't seem like the monster I'd built him up to be in my mind. He didn't actively mock me, but that didn't mean I was safe. The tension between us was palpable, and I couldn't figure out if he was just messing with me or if something else was going on. It was these moments that made my confusion grow. He wasn't acting like the bully I knew. Sure, he still threw in the occasional sarcastic remark, but there was something different about his presence, something that kept me on edge. I took a deep breath and tried to ignore the gnawing feeling in my stomach. My best bet was to keep quiet and focus on the work. But then, out of nowhere, I felt it. A soft brush of his fingers against my hand as he reached for one of the books we were supposed to be using. It was light, almost accidental, but my entire body froze. I wasn't sure if he meant to do it, but it didn't feel like an accident. Brandon didn't say anything. He just kept his gaze fixed on the textbook in front of him, flipping through the pages with that same bored expression he always wore. But my mind was reeling. My hand was still tingling from the brief contact, and I couldn't shake the feeling that something had shifted between us. Was it just my imagination? Or had he meant to touch me? I had no idea, but the tension in the room felt thick, like the air had changed, and suddenly, every small movement he made seemed amplified. His every breath, every shift in position, it all felt like it was directed at me. I focused on my work again, trying to push away the sensation, but my fingers shook as I wrote, and I couldn't ignore the heat that had started to build between us. I hated myself for feeling this way. I hated how much his proximity affected me, but there was nothing I could do about it. Finally, as the minutes stretched into hours, the library began to empty out. Most students were done for the day, leaving just me and Brandon. I didn't know how much more I could take of this strange, unsettling dynamic between us. The clock ticked on, and I tried to ignore the fact that I could feel his presence in every corner of the room. Then, as the final bell rang, signaling the end of our study time, I quickly gathered my things. "I'll see you tomorrow," I muttered, eager to escape the awkwardness of the situation. Brandon didn't respond immediately, and I almost thought he was ignoring me. But then, just as I was about to turn away, he called out in that teasing tone that made my heart skip a beat. "Don't run off so fast, Reed. You might actually start enjoying this." I froze at the sound of his voice. What did he mean by that? Before I could come up with a response, he stood up and stretched, his eyes never leaving me. I couldn't tell if he was serious, mocking me, or just being his usual self. Either way, the weight of his words lingered in the air as I hurried out of the library, my heart pounding. And now I had to face the reality of it all. The next day, I walked into school with the sinking feeling of someone who knew they were in way over their head. It was hard to focus on anything else besides the fact that I had another study session with Brandon that afternoon. I kept replaying the previous day in my head, over and over, each moment sharper than the last. The brush of his fingers, the strange intensity in his eyes, the way my heart skipped when he'd made that comment about me enjoying it. I couldn't tell if he was just messing with me or if there was something else going on. Either way, I had no idea how to handle it. I wasn't prepared for this. School passed in a blur, and as the final bell rang, my stomach tightened in anticipation of the next few hours. I made my way to the library, hoping to find a way to focus on the material at hand and ignore the whirlwind of emotions swirling in my chest. But as I stepped into the familiar quiet of the library, I spotted him immediately. Brandon was already there, lounging at our usual table, his feet kicked up on the chair across from him. He didn't even glance up as I approached, acting like it was just another day. That confidence of his, it drove me insane. "Hey, Reed," he greeted without looking at me, his voice lazy and calm. "Glad you showed up on time this time. Can't say the same for you yesterday." I rolled my eyes and sat down, trying to ignore the way his voice made my pulse race. "It's not like you're exactly a model student yourself." He finally glanced up from the textbook he was pretending to read, his eyes flickering with amusement. "Touché," he said, his smirk widening. "But I'm here now, aren't I? We might actually get something done today." I didn't know if I believed that, But I wasn't about to argue with him, not when I was already feeling so unsettled. I opened my own textbook, determined to focus, but the way Brandon kept looking at me out of the corner of his eye made it impossible. There was something about the way his gaze lingered, like he was studying me, trying to figure me out. Every time I looked up, his eyes would quickly dart away, and I'd be left wondering if I imagined the brief moments of intensity. "Don't act like you're actually interested in the material," I muttered, keeping my eyes fixed on the page. Brandon chuckled, low and soft. "Oh, I'm interested, just not in what you're reading." I shot him a look, but he was already leaning back in his chair, tapping his pen against the desk. I tried to ignore him, but his presence was all-consuming. I couldn't focus on the words in front of me with him sitting there, so close, making me aware of every little movement he made. His foot nudged my leg under the table, but I didn't flinch, at least not visibly. My heartbeat quickened, and I felt the heat rush to my face, but I didn't pull away. His foot lingered for a moment before he pulled it back, but that wasn't what made me freeze. It was the look in his eyes as he watched me carefully. He knew what he was doing. He isn't stupid. But why? I forced myself to look back at the textbook, trying to push the weird feeling away. It wasn't like I hadn't dealt with his teasing before, but this felt different. There was something behind his actions, something I couldn't quite put my finger on. My fingers gripped the edge of the book a little tighter as I fought to steady my nerves. The minutes dragged on in silence, but the tension between us was undeniable. Brandon wasn't trying to study, and I knew that. He was just sitting there, waiting for me to break, for me to respond to whatever silent challenge he'd thrown my way. But I wasn't going to give him that satisfaction. Couldn't. At some point, the soft ticking of the clock on the wall became unbearably loud. I could feel his eyes on me again, burning into my side. I bit my lip, trying to keep my attention on the text. I didn't want to look at him, didn't want to give him any reason to tease me more. But then I heard it, the quiet scrape of Brandon's chair moving closer to mine. Without looking up, I could feel him leaning in, just inches away. The warmth of his body hovered over mine, and I cursed myself for being so aware of every detail. His breath brushed against my ear, and I froze. "You're really tense, Reed," he whispered, his voice too close, too intimate. I could hear the smirk in his voice, feel it in the way he leaned in just a little more. "You should relax." The words, combined with the feeling of his body just behind mine, made my skin crawl and burn at the same time. My heart raced in my chest, and I could feel my hands trembling on the desk. I didn't know how to react. I wanted to tell him to stop, to tell him that this wasn't funny, but the words wouldn't come. I couldn't find my voice. Instead, I focused on my breath, trying to steady myself. "I'm fine," I managed to say, but my voice came out quieter than I wanted it to. "I'm just trying to concentrate." Brandon's chuckle was low and dark. "Sure you are." He pulled back, but not far enough to make me feel safe. I could still feel him near, his presence so close it felt like he was suffocating me. He was just sitting there, leaning back in his chair like he was completely at ease, while I was a mess inside. I wanted to push him away, tell him to stop, but the words wouldn't come. I didn't know why it was so hard. Maybe it was because, despite everything, there was something about him that made my body respond in ways I couldn't explain. His teasing, his closeness, it all had this strange effect on me, one I didn't want to acknowledge. "Come on, Reed," Brandon said after a few minutes of silence, his tone now lighter, as if we were just two normal people. "You don't actually care about this stuff, do you? You're just here because they told us we had to work together." I wanted to argue, to tell him that I did care, that I wanted to do well in the competition, but it felt like he wasn't really interested in that. He wasn't trying to study. He was just here because he had to be, and he was finding ways to get under my skin. The quiet tension between us continued to build, like a thread pulling tighter and tighter. My mind was all over the place, and every time I looked up, Brandon's gaze was on me, sharp and calculating. He wasn't saying much, but his eyes never left me, and I couldn't understand why that bothered me so much. For the next hour, we sat in an uncomfortable silence. my focus completely shattered by his presence. I tried to get back to my work, but it felt impossible. Every time I turned a page, every time I tried to read a single line, his presence was there, invading my thoughts. His teasing, his smirking, his quiet challenges. It all made it harder and harder to focus. Then, as the minutes stretched into an eternity, Brandon pushed back from the table and stood up. "I'm done," he said, his tone carefree as he stretched his arms over his head. "I'm not wasting my time here if you're just going to be boring about it." I blinked at him, unsure of how to respond. "What? You're just leaving?" "Yeah," he said, smirking down at me. "You're no fun, Reed. Can't study with someone who's this uptight." I stood up to follow him, but before I could get my things together, he was already walking toward the door. "Hey," I called after him, feeling a flash of irritation flare up. "You can't just bail on me like that." Brandon didn't even turn around. "You'll be fine. Besides, you're the one who seems to want this competition more than I do. Good luck with it, nerd." And with that, he was gone. I stood there for a few moments, frozen in place, my mind still processing the strange encounter. I hadn't expected that. I hadn't expected him to just leave, to walk out so easily. Felt like he'd just dropped the bomb, and now I was left to deal with the fallout. The confusion, the frustration, the strange tension that had been building between us. It was all still there, hanging in the air, and I couldn't shake the feeling that somehow, it wasn't over yet. Not by a long shot. I couldn't stop thinking about what happened in the library. Not the study session itself, but what had come after. Brandon's unexpected departure. The way he'd acted as if nothing had changed between us. Nothing had shifted. But everything had shifted. I'd been left standing there, heart pounding, my skin tingling with the memory of his proximity, his teasing, and the awkward, unsettling silence that followed. The next few days passed in a blur. I tried to focus on the competition, tried to bury myself in my schoolwork, but Brandon's presence haunted me. Every time I walked through the hallways, I half expected to bump into him, to see that smirk on his face, to feel that weight in the air that made my chest tighten. But I didn't, not at first anyway. Then, on Thursday afternoon, I got an email from the school. It was an update on the academic competition, and this time, instead of feeling the usual sense of determination, I felt a knot form in my stomach as I saw Brandon's name on the list again. We were supposed to meet that day for another study session. I hadn't heard from him since our last encounter, and I had no idea what to expect. Would he show up this time, or would he bail again? I didn't know which outcome would be worse. I was already in the library when I saw him, sauntering through the door like he owned the place. His usual swagger was in full force, and for a brief moment, I wondered if I could just disappear. But that wasn't an option. So, I tried to act like everything was fine, even though my heart was pounding in my chest. Brandon spotted me immediately, of course. His eyes locked onto mine with that same smug look I'd come to know all too well, and I braced myself for whatever was coming next. "You're early today, Reed," he said, dropping his backpack onto the table with exaggerated care. "I am impressed. Must be really into this whole studying thing." I didn't respond right away. I wasn't sure how to. The last time we'd been in the library together, it felt like everything had gotten weird, and I had no idea how to handle that. "I'm just here to do the work," I said, my voice a little more clipped than I intended. Yeah, I'm sure you are," he replied, sliding into the chair across from me. "But you know, Reed, you don't have to be such a buzzkill all the time." I rolled my eyes, trying to push aside the anxiety that had begun to creep up my spine. "I'm just trying to get through this." He shrugged, clearly uninterested in my attempts to keep things focused. "Whatever you say, nerd. Let's just get this over with." He opened the textbook, his posture relaxed, but there was a tension in the way he held his body, like he was waiting for something. I couldn't place it, but the air between us was charged, thick with unspoken words and unresolved feelings. It was strange how quickly things had shifted, how quickly everything had changed. I tried to focus on the material, but the words blurred together on the page. Every time I glanced up, I found myself looking at Brandon, his gaze still lingering on me like he was waiting for something. I couldn't figure out what it was, but I was starting to feel like I was being pulled in two different directions. One part of me wanted to just get through the session and get out of there. The other part of me, the part one didn't want to acknowledge, wanted to stay, wanted to understand what was going on between us. Brandon leaned back in his chair, stretching his arms overhead with a casual ease that made my breath hitch. "You're really not going to talk to me today, huh?" I looked up, a little startled by the sudden change in his tone. "What do you mean?" "I mean, you've been acting weird," he said, his eyes narrowing slightly. "It's like you're afraid to look at me, Reed. You don't want to talk to me. Is that it?" I forced myself to look away, my cheeks flushing with embarrassment. "I'm not afraid of you," I muttered, although I wasn't entirely sure that was true. I wasn't afraid of him in the way you'd expect, not really. But there was something about him, something that made me feel small, out of control. Brandon tilted his head, studying me closely. "Then what is it? You think I'm going to bite?" I felt the weight of his words hang in the air. I wasn't sure how to respond to that. Was he trying to provoke me again? Or was he genuinely curious? Couldn't tell. The uncertainty made my chest tighten. "No," I said quietly. I'm not here for whatever game you're playing." His lips curled into a half smirk, the kind that made me feel both unsettled and intrigued. "Game? You think I'm playing a game?" "I don't know," I said, my voice a little more defensive than I intended. "You've been acting different." "Different?" He repeated the word, and for a second, there was something in his eyes that looked almost confused, passed quickly, replaced by that same cocky confidence. "What? You mean like I'm not making fun of you every 5 seconds?" I didn't know how to respond to that. There were so many things I wanted to say, so many things that didn't make sense to me, but I kept them bottled up. I couldn't make sense of my own feelings, let alone try to explain them to him. Brandon leaned forward, his elbows on the table, his gaze intense. "You know, Reed, you're really hard to figure out. I thought I had you all figured out, but you keep surprising me." I could feel the heat rise to my face. "I'm not some puzzle to be solved," I said, my voice coming out sharper than I meant. He just chuckled, clearly unfazed by my defensiveness. "No, you're not. But you sure are complicated." The words lingered between us, heavy and full of meaning. It was as if he was trying to peel back the layers of who I was, trying to figure out what made me tick. But I wasn't ready to let him in. Not like that. I wasn't sure I even wanted to know what it would mean if he did. I pushed the thoughts aside and focused on the task at hand. We were supposed to be working, and I didn't want to waste the time we had. But it was hard to concentrate with Brandon still watching me, his gaze never leaving my face. I tried to push the unease aside, but the longer we sat there, the more it grew. The tension was thick, palpable, and it felt like I was walking a tightrope. Every word, every glance seemed loaded with meaning, and I couldn't shake the feeling that something was about to shift again. Then, out of nowhere, Brandon stood up, and my heart skipped a beat. "I'm done for today," he said, his voice casual but his eyes focused on me. "We can finish this later." I blinked at him, unsure of what to make of it. "You're leaving?" "Yeah," he said, shrugging. "I'm not exactly feeling the whole steady vibe today." I stared at him for a moment, trying to read his expression. I was almost relieved, but also disappointed. It was like he was playing with me, leaving me hanging every time. "Okay," I said, standing up to gather my things. "I'll see you later, I guess." He didn't respond right away. He just stood there, watching me, that same unreadable expression on his face. "You know, Reed," he said, his voice quieter now, "you're not as easy to figure out as you think." I froze, unsure of what to say. There was something in his voice now, something that wasn't teasing or mocking. It almost sounded like he was trying to be serious. I didn't know how to respond to that, so I just nodded, my mind swirling with confusion. Brandon turned and walked away, leaving me standing there, heart pounding, unsure of what had just happened. I couldn't shake the feeling that he was playing some kind of game, but I was starting to wonder if maybe, just maybe, I was part of it now. I had never really been a person who thrived on uncertainty. In fact, I'd always prided myself on being able to predict outcomes, on having control over situations. But lately, everything about Brandon felt like I was in the midst of a storm with no way out. I couldn't predict him anymore, couldn't figure out what he wanted from me, or if I even wanted to know. The past week had felt like a whirlwind of emotions, each encounter with him leaving me more confused than the last. By Friday, I was on edge. Every time I stepped into class, I half expected him to be there, acting like nothing had changed. I tried to keep my head down, focus on my work, but it was impossible. Brandon's presence in the hallway, his constant teasing, had become an unavoidable distraction. He made it hard for me to think straight, and the worst part was, I wasn't sure if I even wanted it to stop. When the bell rang for lunch, I tried to slip out of the classroom quickly, but of course, I didn't get far. As I walked through the halls, my mind buzzing with 100 different thoughts, I saw him. Brandon was leaning against the lockers, arms crossed, watching me with that familiar smirk on his face. His eyes gleamed with something unreadable, something that made my pulse skip. "Hey, Reed," he said, pushing off the lockers and standing up straighter. "You got a minute?" I stopped in my tracks, unsure of what to do. I wanted to avoid him, to just keep walking, but somehow, my feet weren't moving. It was like he had a hold on me, pulling me in without even trying. "What do you want, Brandon?" I asked, trying to sound indifferent, but I could hear the tension in my voice. It was getting harder and harder to hide it. He took a step closer, his smirk widening. "Relax. I'm just trying to talk." "About what?" I replied, crossing my arms over my chest, trying to appear composed even though my heart was pounding. He studied me for a moment, his gaze sharp and intense, like he was trying to read me. "About us." "Us," I repeated, incredulous. "There is no us." Brandon just chuckled, shaking his head. "You're so fucking stubborn. You know that?" I felt my stomach tighten at his words, but I refused to let him see how much they affected me. "I'm not stubborn. I just don't know what you're playing at. You've been messing with me for weeks now, and I don't get it." "You don't get it?" he repeated, his voice lowering slightly, almost as if he was speaking to himself. "You're not the only one confused here, Reed." I looked at him, confused by the sudden change in his tone. There was something in his eyes now that wasn't mocking or teasing. It almost looked like frustration, maybe even vulnerability, but I didn't have time to think about it, because before I could process anything, he stepped closer, his breath warm against my face. "Why do you act like you're so fucking sure of yourself, like you don't care, when I know damn well you do?" I froze, my breath catching in my throat. The way he looked at me, like he could see through every defense I'd built up, made me feel exposed. I wanted to pull away, but I couldn't. His presence was overwhelming, and for some reason I didn't want to fight it. "I don't know what you're talking about," I said, my voice shaky. I was lying, of course. I knew exactly what he meant, but admitting it out loud felt like giving in, and I wasn't sure I was ready to do that yet. Brandon didn't say anything at first. He just stood there, his eyes never leaving mine, as if he were waiting for me to crack. His face was so close to mine now, our breaths mingling in the small space between us. I could feel the heat radiating off of him, and my heart pounded in my chest. The moment stretched out, the air thick with tension, until I couldn't take it anymore. I turned my head slightly, breaking the eye contact, but it didn't make things any easier. In fact, it only seemed to make it worse. I could feel the pull of his gaze even without seeing it, like he was still right there, studying me, waiting for something. "I don't want to play your games, Brandon," I muttered, my voice barely above a whisper. Brandon was silent for a beat, and I dared a glance back at him. He was watching me intently, his eyes narrowing slightly. "I'm not playing a game," he said, his voice softer now, more serious. "I'm just trying to figure you out." I didn't know how to respond to that. He was so close now that I could feel the warmth of his body, and it was doing strange things to my insides. I wanted to step back, to put some distance between us, but my body wouldn't move. Why? I finally managed to ask, my voice barely audible. Why me? He didn't answer right away, and I was beginning to wonder if I'd crossed some invisible line by asking that question. But then he let out a slow breath, and for a moment, I thought he was going to say something that would make everything clearer. I don't know, he said quietly, his voice tinged with something I couldn't quite place. Maybe because you're the only person who doesn't just let me walk all over them. Everyone else does, but not you. The words hit me harder than I expected. They made something twist uncomfortably in my chest. I didn't want to be the person who made him feel like he couldn't just dominate everyone around him. But at the same time, I didn't want to be the one who let him get too close either. I'm not a challenge for you to win, I said, my voice firm, though I could feel the cracks in it. I'm not some game for you to figure out. Brandon tilted his head, studying me for a long moment. Maybe you're not, but you sure as hell make things interesting, Reed. More interesting than anyone else around here. I shook my head, trying to push away the way his words made me feel. I didn't want to admit it, but there was a part of me, more than I cared to acknowledge, that liked the attention, that liked the way he made me feel. But I couldn't let myself go there. I couldn't allow myself to get tangled in whatever mess this was becoming. I turned to leave, needing some space to breathe, but Brandon caught my arm, his grip firm but not painful. You're not getting off that easy. I looked at him, my heart racing. Let go, Brandon. He didn't move, though. He kept his hand on my arm, his fingers lightly brushing against my skin. I could feel the heat of his touch seeping into me, making everything feel more intense, more dangerous. Just listen, he said, his voice low and serious. I'm not going to keep doing this cat and mouse crap. Either you're in or you're out. But you can't keep pretending you don't feel anything. I wanted to say something, wanted to tell him to let go and leave me alone, but I couldn't find the words. The truth was, I didn't want him to leave. Not really. I'm not pretending, I said, my voice barely a whisper. But I don't know what you want from me. Brandon's grip on my arm loosened, and for a moment, I thought he was going to let go, to step back and let me walk away. But instead, he pulled me a little closer, his hand brushing against my cheek. His thumb ran along the line of my jaw, and I froze, couldn't breathe. You don't have to know, he said softly, his eyes locked on mine. Not yet. Felt like time stopped in that moment. Every nerve in my body was on fire, every thought scattered. I could feel my breath catching in my throat, my mind screaming for me to pull away, but my body didn't listen. I couldn't move. Brandon's gaze softened for a split second, and then he let go, stepping back, leaving me standing there, my heart racing, my mind spinning. Think about it, he said quietly, before walking away, disappearing into the crowd of students. I stood frozen, my body still buzzing from the sensation of his touch. What the hell had just happened? And more importantly, what was I supposed to do now? I spent the rest of the day in a daze, my mind replaying that moment over and over again. Brandon's hand on my arm, his thumb brushing my skin. The way he had looked at me, almost like I was something he could understand, something worth figuring out. I couldn't shake the way it felt, the heat of his touch still lingering on my skin, making my thoughts scatter every time I tried to focus. The more I thought about it, the more I realized I couldn't just brush it off. The connection between us, whatever it was, had shifted in a way I couldn't ignore. The line between teasing and something else was becoming blurred, and I wasn't sure how to navigate it. I couldn't tell if he was toying with me or if he genuinely felt something. And honestly, I didn't know which would hurt more. I tried to avoid him for the rest of the week, giving him space to do whatever he was going to do, but it was impossible. He was everywhere. I turned a corner and there he was, in the cafeteria, leaning casually against the lunch line, his eyes scanning the room until they landed on me. In the hallways, his presence felt like a weight on my shoulders, always lurking, always just a step behind. By the time Friday afternoon rolled around, I was exhausted. I hadn't been able to sleep properly all week, my mind constantly replaying every moment with Brandon, trying to decipher his intentions. And now it was happening again. The same tug of war between wanting to stay away and not wanting to let him go. I was walking to my locker after class when I saw him again, standing by the stairwell, his arms crossed, waiting for me like he had all the time in the world. His eyes locked onto mine the moment I turned the corner, and it felt like the ground beneath me shifted. "Reed," he called, his voice carrying through the hall. I didn't stop. I didn't even acknowledge him at first. I was still wrestling with everything that had happened, still unsure of where I stood in all of this. I wasn't sure I was ready to face him again. I wasn't sure if I could handle another moment of whatever this was between us. But then he was there, in front of me, blocking my way with a casual smile that didn't reach his eyes. It was the kind of smile that could mean 1,000 things, none of them good. "Hey," he said, his voice low and almost playful. "You've been avoiding me." I raised an eyebrow, trying to keep my composure. "I haven't been avoiding you," I said, my voice stiff, even though I knew I was lying. I had been avoiding him. Couldn't help it. It felt too intense, too much, and I wasn't sure what to do with all the emotions swirling inside me. Brandon studied me for a moment, his smirk never faltering. "Then why do you look like you're about to run away?" he asked, his tone almost teasing. But there was something more beneath it, something I couldn't quite put my finger on. "I'm not running away," I replied, my voice tight. "I'm just not interested in whatever it is you're doing." He chuckled, the sound low and rough. "You're so fucking stubborn," he said, shaking his head. "I'm not doing anything, Reed. I'm just trying to get through to you." I swallowed hard, feeling the weight of his words settle in my chest. "What do you want from me, Brandon?" I asked, the question escaping before I could stop it. He stepped closer, his eyes narrowing slightly, as if he were searching for something in my expression. "I want you to stop pretending like you don't care, like you don't feel anything when I'm around." My heart skipped a beat at his words. I wanted to deny it, to push him away and pretend like I didn't feel anything. But the truth was, I couldn't. I couldn't pretend that the way he made me feel didn't matter. I took a step back, trying to put some distance between us. "I don't know what you think is happening here, but I'm not your plaything," I said, my voice wavering despite my best efforts to sound firm. Brandon's expression softened, but it wasn't the usual mocking softness. There was something more sincere in the way he looked at me, something that made my breath catch in my throat. "I never said you were," he said quietly, his voice low and uncharacteristically serious. "I don't know what the hell this is either, Reed, but I'm not gonna let you act like you don't care when I know you do." I felt the weight of his words hit me harder than I expected. He was right, in a way. I couldn't pretend that I didn't care. The feelings were there, growing stronger every time he spoke to me, every time he looked at me. But I wasn't ready to admit that to him, or to myself. "I don't know what you want me to say," I said, my voice almost a whisper. "I don't know what I'm supposed to do with this." He stepped closer again, and this time I didn't pull away. His presence was magnetic, pulling me in like I couldn't help it. He reached out and gently touched my arm, the contact sending a shiver down my spine. "You don't have to say anything," he murmured, his gaze softening just a little. "But don't lie to me. Not about this." His touch was like fire, but it was also strangely comforting in a way I didn't understand. My body was screaming at me to step back, to put up the walls I'd so carefully built, but a part of me wanted to stay right there, to let the tension and the uncertainty hang in the air like a thread between us. I didn't speak for a long moment, just stood there, trying to make sense of everything swirling inside me. I could feel my heartbeat in my throat, the thumping of it deafening in my ears. I wanted to say something, anything, to break the silence, but I didn't know what. "You don't have to figure it all out right now," he said, his voice barely audible. "But you can't keep running from it either." I opened my mouth to respond, but before I could, the bell rang, signaling the end of lunch. I quickly stepped away from him, suddenly overwhelmed, needing space, needing to breathe. I turned and walked down the hallway, not looking back, but knowing he was watching me the entire way. The rest of the day passed in a blur, my mind still caught on what had just happened. Brandon's words, his touch, Everything about that moment echoed in my mind, and I couldn't shake it, couldn't shake him. I was getting pulled deeper into something I didn't understand, something I wasn't sure I was ready for. But the more I tried to push it away, the more it came back, stronger than before. And I didn't know how much longer I could keep pretending I didn't feel it too. The weekend had passed in a haze, the weight of everything that had happened between Brandon and me settling deep in my chest. I'd avoided his gaze all day Friday, and now it felt like I was doing the same thing in my own head. My thoughts constantly looped back to him, to the moments I'd spent with him, wondering if any of it had been real, or if I had simply imagined it all, a daydream I couldn't shake. But there was no escaping it. The truth was, I'd never felt more alive in the presence of someone I hated. Or maybe it wasn't hate. Not anymore. I'd spent so long telling myself that I couldn't like him, that I couldn't let him get to me. But the truth had become clearer every day. I didn't know what the hell I felt. Not anymore. Monday morning arrived, and with it, the usual routine. Half-heartedly getting dressed, grabbing my books, barely managing to eat breakfast before running out the door. But this time, something was different. Something hung in the air, charged with the electric tension I couldn't shake. The unspoken feelings that had only been growing since that moment in the hallway. I couldn't push it down anymore. Not with the way my heart raced whenever I thought about seeing him again. I stepped into school, already on edge, knowing that he would be somewhere, lurking in the shadows. I could feel his presence before I even saw him. He always seemed to be near me, watching me, waiting for the right moment to make his move. And today felt like that moment. I wasn't ready, but I also couldn't avoid it. As I walked to my first class, the sound of footsteps behind me made my skin prickle. I didn't have to turn around to know it was him. I could feel it. His energy was so undeniable, like a pull I couldn't escape. I kept walking, my pace quickening without meaning to. But of course, he caught up with me. Reed. Brandon's voice was close, just behind me, and the hairs on the back of my neck stood up. I took a breath, trying to steady myself before I faced him. I had to face him. There was no way around it now. I turned, and there he was, standing just a few inches away, his eyes bright with that glint I couldn't decipher. There was something about the way he looked at me, something too intense that made me want to take a step back. But I didn't. I didn't back down. "What do you want, Brandon?" I asked, my voice steady, even though I felt everything inside me shaking. "You," he said simply, his gaze never leaving mine. It wasn't the answer I expected. For a moment, I was speechless, trying to process what he meant, trying to understand how he could make everything seem so simple. But it wasn't simple. It was complicated. It was terrifying. "Stop playing games," I said, my voice sharp, trying to get control of myself. "You've had your fun. I'm not going to be part of it." Brandon shook his head, his expression softening. "You're not a game to me, Reed. Not anymore." I felt a strange lump form in my throat at his words. Was he being serious? Was this all part of some sick joke? I wanted to call him out on it, to tell him to stop messing with my head. But the way he looked at me, the way his eyes held something deeper, something raw, made it harder to breathe. I wasn't sure if I was ready to face the truth. "I don't know what this is," I said, shaking my head. "But I'm not going to be caught up in some twisted thing with you." "You're already caught up," he replied softly, taking a step closer, his body nearly touching mine. The proximity was suffocating. His presence, once just a nuisance, now felt like an anchor, keeping me in place when all I wanted to do was escape. I started, but the words died in my throat when he reached out and gently cupped my face. His touch was soft, almost tender, in direct contrast to everything I thought I knew about him. "Don't fight it," he murmured, his voice low, almost a whisper. "I'm not going anywhere." I felt a shiver run down my spine, a cold chill that had nothing to do with the temperature. His thumb brushed over my lips, and my breath hitched. The air between us crackled, and suddenly, I couldn't think straight. The lines between right and wrong, good and bad, blurred until there was nothing left but the two of us, caught in the middle of something we couldn't control. For a moment, All I could do was stand there, my body frozen, unsure of what to do. I'd always been the one who had control. I'd always been the one who didn't let anyone get too close, too deep. But Brandon was different. He didn't care about the walls I built around myself. He saw right through them. "I don't know what you want," I whispered, my voice breaking. "But I can't do this." He didn't respond right away. Instead, he lowered his hand from my face and stepped back, giving me some space. I could see the flicker of something, frustration, maybe, or something more, cross his face before he masked it with that same cool, collected demeanor he always wore. "I don't want you to do anything," he said softly. "I just want you to stop pretending this doesn't matter." I stared at him, unable to speak. The confusion, the anger, the desire all swirling inside me, creating a storm that I didn't know how to calm. "I don't know what I feel," I admitted finally, my voice barely above a whisper. "And I don't know what you feel either. Whatever this is, it's not something I can just ignore." Brandon's eyes softened. "I don't expect you to have it all figured out, but we don't have to ignore it, Reed. You're not the only one feeling this." The weight of his words sank in, and for the first time in what felt like forever, I wasn't sure what to say. I didn't want to admit it, but I knew he was right. I couldn't keep pretending like I wasn't drawn to him, like the tension between us wasn't real. The truth was, I wasn't ready to deal with it. But maybe I didn't have to. Maybe I could just let it happen. "Brandon," I began, but I wasn't sure where to go from there. The words felt too heavy to speak, too vulnerable to let out into the open. Before I could finish my thought, he took a step forward again, closing the distance between us. He looked at me with those eyes, those damn eyes that made everything inside me go numb, like I couldn't breathe or think or move. And then he kissed me. It was soft at first, tentative, like he was waiting for me to pull away. But I didn't. I didn't want to pull away. I wanted to feel it. I wanted to know if this was real, if this moment was something I could trust. His lips pressed against mine gently, but it was enough to make everything else fall away. All the noise, all the doubt, gone. When he pulled back, I was breathless. My heart was hammering in my chest, and my mind was spinning. I wanted to say something, anything, but there were no words. There was only this, only the way he looked at me, the way he made me feel like nothing else mattered. "You're not alone in this," he said, his voice barely audible. I swallowed hard, trying to process everything. "I don't know if I can do this." Brandon's expression softened, and he reached out, his hand resting gently on mine. "You don't have to know right now. We'll figure it out." And for the first time in weeks, I wasn't sure of anything. But maybe that was okay. Maybe I didn't need to have everything figured out. Maybe I could just trust him, trust myself. For the first time in a long time, I wasn't running. And maybe that was all I needed to know.